All right, my name's Mitcham, of course, one of two assistant principals here at C. Hannah. You guys know that. We work together every day. What we're going to talk about today is a state report on how our students performed on state assessments. Talk a little bit about what the report means, what it tells us, what it means to us for our school, and what it tells us that we can do to improve at our school. The report I'm going to use today is a Parker report. Of course, we use the Aspire now. This is going to talk about the ARP test, but the same thing still applies as the reports that we get from Aspire, which are a little bit different looking, but tell us the same types of things. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And most importantly, explain, when we look at a report like this as a school, what things do we look at that are important to us? What do we take out of this report that we can use to show where we need to focus on as administration, as teachers, and where the groups are in our school that are the most needy and need the most help. One of the pages on the Parker, let me talk a little bit about the Parker report first. The report is actually designed, or the major reason it's the way it is, it's designed to give scoring information on subgroups. Subgroups, of course, mean white students, black students, special ed students, poverty students, non-poverty students. So the report is designed to break down how each one of those groups performed on a state assessment and then show you how they are performing in comparison to one another. The big thing about this report that's important to us in all schools is this right here. It allows schools to determine where there exist gaps between those subgroups. The big thing for No Child Left Behind, the next endeavor we're in with President Obama, all those things is to show that we are closing gaps between subgroups. In other words, we're showing that we are closing that white students and black students are performing closer together. Special needs and non-special needs students are reporting closer together. Another big subgroup or big topic is poverty and non-poverty. You know, statistics and research shows us over time that non-poverty students are going to outperform poverty students. And I'm going to talk about our school in particular and how that's not the case here with us. And like I just mentioned, the goal of this report is to take and show specifically where do we have the most need so that we can close those gaps. That's what the report tells us. You can see some of this. You can see here you have a report on our white population. Here you have a report on our black population. Here you have the gap between those. Each part of that test, how big was the gap between them? Same thing, non-poverty, poverty, the gap between those, because those are the big areas of focus, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about with our school. One thing interesting to mention, you already know this and I know this, but one thing interesting about our school is we are what's called a focus school with the State Department, meaning that the State Department of Education sends and has already sent people to meet with our principals and our administration and our board office to talk about why we're a focus school and what they suggest we do to remedy that. The reason we in particular at C. Hannah are a focus school has to do with the gap between our special education and non-special education students. If you look at our data over the past few years, what it shows is that our non-special ed students and our special ed students are both continuing to show improvement. They're both moving in this direction. So what we're doing is working. The problem is the gap between how the special ed students and how the non-special ed students are performing, that gap is not closing. They're running parallel. They're both continuing to improve. We're just not closing the gap. In other words, we're not getting the special ed students up to performing at the level that non-special ed students are performing, which of course, to me, in realistic and common sense terms, shouldn't happen because these students are special ed for a reason. They have a learning disability that is not allowing them to perform at the same level as a non-special ed student. So we are, as a school, doing a great job. We are doing what a lot of times does not happen, which is continuing to show improvement with our special ed population. We're just not. What would have to happen is the special ed population would have to improve at a faster rate than the non-special ed student to close that gap, which is very, very, as you can imagine, very difficult to do. This just talks a little bit about the color code. We don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time on this. What I wanted you to see, when you look at the full report, this color code shows you, for instance, the darkest green means our school system's percentage at level 4 is 10 or more points above the target. In other words, that dark green means that population, wherever there's a dark green, is performing quite a bit over a level 4, over what the target is. The The interesting thing on this report that I want to point out is this, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide in just a minute. This tells you the importance of looking at subgroups' performances. The report has a special color designated just for the gap in those subgroups. In other words, if you look on that report, there's a color to designate to show there's a gap that's significant here between these subgroup populations. I'll talk about that in my next slide. Like I just mentioned, the report gives a color scheme for each level percent for the school or the school system. In other words, when we're using orange, it shows you what percentage of our students scored level 4, which is the highest, of course. What percentage of our students scored level 3. Level 3 and level 4, when we were using that test, is considered proficient, or was considered proficient. Anything at level 2 or level 1 means that student was not performing at proficiency. So it gives you a color code for all that. It's interesting that I just pointed out a minute ago that the report gives a specific color for subgroup gaps. Going back to what I just mentioned a second ago, special ed and non-special ed, or let's use another example, poverty and non-poverty students. Research over time and statistically tells us non-poverty students should outperform poverty students. That's not the case at our school. The last report we got, our non-poverty students are actually being outperformed by our poverty students. Research says that should not happen. So in my opinion, Mr. McCall, the principal's opinion, that is a gigantic compliment to you ladies and guys, the teachers. You are able to do with our students what research says should not happen. Doesn't mean that our non-poverty students are not performing. They are performing and showing continuous improvement. There's not a gap there, though. That's why we're not a focus school based on that gap. There's not a gap between poverty and non-poverty, and research says there should be, but there's not. So that's a compliment to us as a school. You don't see that very often at all at schools happening. But it's interesting that the big deal about this report is that where are gaps existing between subgroups, and then when we put that data into our CIP plan, our action plan, what are we going to do as a school specifically in each subject area to address that gap? What are we going to do with our special ed students specifically to try or attempt to close that gap between special ed and non-special ed? That's what that means. A couple of other things to end up this report. It's not a real complicated report, obviously, to read. But this tells you a little bit about what I was just mentioning a few minutes ago. It's measured by the percent of students performing at level 3. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, and you already know this as teachers. Level 3 and level 4 on that test was considered proficient. Level 1 means they don't meet academic standards at all. Level 2 meant the student partially met the standards. Level 3, like I just mentioned, means they met the bare minimum standards, and that was the big problem with the ARMT versus what we've gone to now with Aspire. We were being misled in Alabama, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinion. We were being misled that students that scored here, you know, they weren't overperforming, but they were good, they were proficient. We're finding out now with Aspire that's not the case. Students that were scoring level 3s on ARMT are not scoring proficient on Aspire. Of course, because of the rigor of the test has increased, but it's giving us, to me, in my opinion, the Aspire that we use now is giving us a better indication of how we are actually performing.